You're ready to unlock the secrets of these tiny charged particles.
Yeah, they impact pretty much everything.
They do. And we're going to start with the basics today. Like what ions are, the different types, and how they even form in the first place.
Right.
Then we'll get into how ions are essential players in, well, everything from our own bodies to some really cool technology.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, let's break it down.
Okay.
So first things first, what exactly are ions?
Okay, so.
I mean, I know they have something to do with atoms and stuff.
Right.
But could you maybe paint a clearer picture for us?
Absolutely. You can think of ions kind of like atoms that have undergone a little bit of a transformation. They've either gained or lost electrons. And those are, those tiny negatively charged particles that are orbiting an atom's nucleus.
Right.
And this gain or loss, it actually creates an imbalance. It leaves the atom with an overall electrical charge.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and that's when it actually becomes an ion.
So it's like the atom suddenly becomes this tiny little magnet.
Yeah.
Attracting or like repelling other charged particles around it?
Yeah, that's a great way to visualize it.
Cool.
And it's this charge that really gives ions all of their very unique properties.
Yeah.
And drives those amazing interactions they have with other ions and even other molecules.
Now, I'm guessing there's not just one type of ion?
Right, you got it.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation?
No, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all.
Okay, so what are the types?
So ions come in two main flavors, you could say.
Okay.
Cations and anions. So cations are the positive ones. And they're formed when an atom loses one or more electrons.
Okay.
A really classic example is sodium, like the key ingredient in table salt.
Okay.
A sodium atom will pretty readily lose an electron, becoming a positively charged sodium ion.
Okay, so sodium's a bit of a lone wolf, happy to give up an electron and go solo as a positively charged cation.
You're right, exactly.
So what about anions? Are those the atoms that just can't get enough electrons?
Exactly. Anions are the negative ions.
Okay.
And those are the ones that are formed when an atom gains one or more electrons.
Gotcha.
A good example to think about there is chlorine, which we use a lot to purify water. It has a really strong affinity for electrons and readily snatches one up, becoming a negatively charged chloride ion.
So sodium in salt is a cation, while chlorine in bleach is an anion. It really hits home that ions aren't just some abstract concept. They're everywhere around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do they form? It's not like atoms are just randomly trading electrons, right? There must be some kind of system.
You're right. They're not just randomly trading electrons. There is a system.
Okay, good.
It's called ionic bonding, and it's all about the attraction between atoms with very different electronegativities.
Electronegativity. That sounds a bit intimidating.
Yeah, it can be a little bit of a mouthful.
It can be, yeah. So could you break that down for us a little?
Okay. You can actually think of it like a tug of war over electrons.
Oh.
So atoms with high electronegativity, they're like the strong players. They have a really powerful pull on those electrons.
So it's all about which atom has the strongest grip on the electrons?
Exactly. And when atoms with very different electronegativities come together, it's like a total mismatch in that tug of war.
Oh, okay.
And one atom will actually just completely pull that electron away from the other one.
Wow. Okay, I'm starting to see how this plays out. Could you walk us through maybe like a real-life example of this electron tug-of-war?
Sure. Let's go back to sodium and chlorine, our little duo here.
Okay.
So sodium, with its low electronegativity, is kind of like the weak player in that tug-of-war. It's holding on to that electron, but not very tightly.
Okay.
But chlorine, on the other hand, has high electronegativity, so it's a powerhouse.
Right. So what happens when they meet? Does chlorine just, like, rip the electron away from sodium?
Pretty much. Chlorine's pull is so strong, it just wins out.
Wow.
And it takes the electron from sodium.
So then sodium's left with?
This leaves sodium with a positive charge.
Okay.
And chlorine with a negative charge.
Right. And then what do we know about opposite charges?
Opposites attract. So the now positively charged sodium ion and the negatively charged chloride ion are drawn to each other.
Oh, okay.
And they form a very strong bond, creating the compound that we all know as sodium chloride or good old table salt.
This is blowing my mind. Who knew something as simple as table salt involved this whole intricate dance of electrons and charges? It seems like we've covered the basics here, like what ions are, the different types, and how they form. But I'm really excited to dive into how these tiny particles actually play out in the real world.
Me too. That's where things get really fascinating.
Yeah.
Next, we can maybe explore how ions are essential players in our own bodies, and even in some really cutting-edge technologies.
Okay, bring on the ions in action.
All right, let's do it. All right, so we've talked about how atoms can become ions, by gaining or losing electrons.
Right.
But let's maybe step back and look at the bigger picture for a minute.
Okay.
Remember how we were talking about electronegativity before?
Yeah, that tug of war over electrons.
Exactly. So like some atoms are super strong and can pull electrons away from those weaker atoms.
Yeah.
But what actually determines an atom's strength in that electron tug of war?
Mm-mm.
Well, it actually all comes down to how those electrons are arranged within the atom itself.
Oh, okay.
You see, electrons aren't just randomly, scattered around the nucleus.
Okay.
They're organized into these specific energy levels.
Uh-huh.
Kind of like, those nested dolls?
Yeah.
Where each layer will hold a certain number of electrons?
Okay. Yeah, I can picture that. So how does this electron arrangement then affect like an atom's tendency to become an ion?
Well, atoms are always striving for stability.
Right.
And a full outermost energy level is like the holy grail of stability for an atom.
Interesting.
You can kind of think of it like having a perfectly organized drawer.
Okay.
Like everything just has its place and it just feels right.
So atoms want to fill up their outermost electron shell just like we want to tidy up our drawers.
Exactly. And that's really where ions come in.
Okay.
So if an atom is just a few electrons short of a full outer shell, it's actually more likely to just gain those electrons and become a negatively charged, anion.
Okay.
On the other hand, if an atom only has one or two electrons in its outer shell, it's a lot easier to just lose those electrons and become a positively charged cation.
Interesting.
It all really comes down to what is the most energetically favorable path to achieving that stable electron configuration.
So it's like the atom is weighing its options, right?
Yeah.
Is it better to gain a few or lose a few?
Right.
Whichever one gets it to that full outer shell faster is the route it'll take.
You got it. It's all about finding the most stable arrangement.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the next time I see sodium chloride, I'll know that it's not just some random combination of atoms. It's the result of sodium and chlorine, each making a strategic decision to achieve that perfect electron configuration.
Exactly. It's really a beautiful example of how nature strives for balance and stability at even the tiniest levels.
Now, I remember you mentioned something called coordination chemistry a little bit earlier.
Oh, yeah.
What was that all about? It sounded like ions were forming some kind of exclusive club.
It is a bit like a club.
Okay.
But instead of, cocktails and mingling, it's all about chemical bonds and shared electrons.
Okay.
So in coordination chemistry, it's metal ions copper or iron. They become the center of attention.
So these metal ions are like the VIPs of the ion world.
You could say that. And surrounding these metal VIPs are other molecules or ions called ligands.
Okay.
And these ligands, they have extra electrons that they're actually willing to share.
Okay.
And they form these bonds with the metal ion, creating what's called a coordination complex.
So it's like the metal ion has a posse of electron-rich buddies hanging out with it.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Cool.
And these coordination complexes are actually, a lot more than just social gatherings.
Oh.
They have some really remarkable properties.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What makes these coordination complexes so special?
Well, for one thing, they can be incredibly colorful.
Okay.
Think about the vibrant green of an emerald or the really deep blue of a copper sulfate solution.
Yeah.
Those colors are actually due to the interaction of light with the coordination complex.
So the color that we see is actually a result of how the coordination complex absorbs and reflects light.
Exactly. And it's not just about, aesthetics either. Coordination complexes play super vital roles in a lot of biological processes.
Oh, wow.
For example, hemoglobin, the protein in our red blood cells that carries oxygen throughout our body.
Yeah.
That's actually built around a coordination complex with an iron ion at its center.
So the reason we can breathe is because of a coordination complex.
It is.
That's amazing.
That iron ion in the hemoglobin, it binds to oxygen molecules, allowing our blood to transport that, essential life-giving gas to all of our cells.
Wow.
And it's not just hemoglobin either.
Oh.
Chlorophyll, the pigment that, makes plants green and enables them to capture sunlight for photosynthesis.
Right.
That's also a coordination complex.
Wow. So coordination complexes are involved in some of life's most essential processes.
They are.
It seems like they're everywhere, doing all sorts of important jobs.
They are everywhere. And, they're not limited to just the natural world either.
Oh, okay.
Coordination complexes are also used in a lot of industrial applications like catalysis.
Catalysis. Now, remind me what that is again.
So a catalyst is kind of like a chemical matchmaker.
Okay.
It speeds up chemical reactions without actually being consumed in the process.
So coordination complexes are like these tiny factories, churning out all sorts of useful products.
Exactly. They're used in the production of, everything from plastics and fertilizers to pharmaceuticals.
This is blowing my mind. We started with like these tiny charged atoms, and now we're talking about coordination complexes that are essential for life, and they power our industries.
Yeah.
And they even create the materials that we use every single day.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
And we've only just begun to explore this vast and intricate world of ions. So far we've mainly been focusing on individual ions and their interactions.
Right.
But what happens when you get a whole bunch of ions together, in a solution?
I imagine it gets a little crowded and chaotic.
It does.
So do those ions still behave in the same way?
That's a great question. And, the answer is it depends.
Okay.
So when ions are really close to each other in a solution, their behavior can be influenced by something called ionic strength.
Ionic strength. What is that exactly?
Think of it kind of like the electrical buzz in a room.
Okay.
That's full of charged particles. So ionic strength is basically a measure of the concentration of ions in a solution.
Okay.
And it takes into account both the number of ions, but also their charges.
So the more ions you pack into a solution and the higher their charges, the stronger the ionic strength.
Exactly. And this ionic strength can have a really big impact on how ions will interact with each other, and even with other molecules in that solution.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could get really complicated. It's like those ions are no longer acting as individuals. They're acting as part of a collective.
Yeah.
Does that change the rules of the game?
It does. In a perfect world, ions would always just behave predictably. Following those neat little chemical equations we all learn in our textbooks.
Yeah.
But in the real world, those interactions between ions in, a really crowded solution can get messy.
So it's like those ions are bumping into each other, disrupting each other's plans.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where this concept of activity coefficients comes in.
Activity coefficients. Sounds intriguing.
So, in an ideal world,
yeah,
an ion's activity, which is a measure of its effective concentration, would be equal to its actual concentration.
Okay.
But all of those interactions between ions can cause some deviations from that ideal behavior.
Right.
So activity coefficients are kind of these correction factors that we use to account for those real world interactions.
So it's those ions are attending a really crowded party, and their activity coefficients are a way of measuring how much they're being affected by all the other partygoers.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
So the more crowded the party, or, the higher that ionic strength, the more those ions are just going to bump into each other and deviate from that ideal behavior.
Wow. So it seems like even in that seemingly chaotic world of a crowded solution, there's still a way to track and understand how those ions behave.
There is.
That's impressive.
It is, and it really just highlights how complex and fascinating the behavior of ions can be.
Yeah.
Especially when you start to consider all of the factors that can influence their interactions.
So we've gone from individual ions to coordination complexes to the collective behavior of ions in solutions. So we're zooming out and seeing the bigger picture of how these tiny charged particles, orchestrate so much of the world around us.
Exactly. And there's still so much more to explore.
Oh, there is.
Oh, yeah. We haven't even touched on the crucial role that ions play in things like electrochemical cells and redox reactions.
Electrochemical cells and redox reactions. Those sound pretty intense.
They're pretty exciting.
Yeah. What kind of ionic adventures are we talking about here? All right, I'm ready for those electrochemical cells and redox reactions.
Okay, let's get into it. Let's start with redox reactions, short for reduction and oxidation.
Okay.
These reactions are all about the transfer of electrons between atoms, molecules, or ions.
So it's kind of like a game of electron hot potato, where one player loses an electron and another one gains it.
That's a really good analogy.
Uh-huh.
The player who loses an electron is said to be oxidized.
Okay.
And the one who gains it is reduced.
Okay.
These redox reactions are actually happening all around us constantly.
Wow.
They're like the driving force behind everything.
Really?
Yeah, from the rusting of iron to like the burning of fuel in our cars.
Wow. Okay. I can see how ions are involved in those redox reactions, like they're the ones gaining or losing the electrons.
Right.
But where do electrochemical cells fit into all of this?
Well, electrochemical cells are these ingenious devices that harness the power of redox reactions to generate electricity.
So they're like tiny power plants converting chemical energy into electrical energy.
Exactly. Think of a battery. That's a perfect example of an electrochemical cell.
Okay. I'm starting to see the connection. But how do they actually work? What's going on inside a battery that lets it, make electricity?
All right, so imagine you have a battery with two electrodes, an anode and a cathode.
Okay.
And these electrodes are immersed in an electrolyte solution, which is just a solution that has ions that can conduct electricity.
So those ions in the electrolyte are like the key players in this whole process.
They are. Yeah. Now, here's where the magic happens.
Okay.
At the anode, there is a chemical reaction where atoms lose electrons.
Okay.
They get oxidized, and then those electrons flow through an external circuit.
Okay.
And that creates the electric current.
So the anode is like the electron launching pad.
Exactly.
Sending those electrons out on their journey.
And then they travel through that circuit to the cathode, where a different reaction takes place.
Okay.
At the cathode, the atoms gain electrons. They're reduced.
So it's like a complete loop with electrons flowing from anode to cathode, driven by those redox reactions happening at each one.
You got it.
Awesome.
And then those ions in the electrolyte solution, they're crucial for keeping everything balanced.
Oh, okay.
So they're migrating between those electrodes, making sure there's charge neutrality.
Okay.
And allowing that flow of electrons to keep going.
So like those ions are the traffic cops, making sure that the flow of electrons is smooth and orderly.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Uh-huh. This is so fascinating. So every time I turn on like my flashlight or even just use my phone, I'm witnessing the power of these redox reactions and those hardworking ions.
You are. And it's not just those like little batteries either. Think about electric cars.
Oh, yeah.
Those use large, powerful batteries. They're basically just scaled up versions of the same principles.
It's amazing to think that these tiny charged particles are driving such huge technological advances.
It is. And as we try to move towards a more sustainable future, electrochemical technologies are becoming even more important.
Right.
They're powered by these amazing ions. For example, like scientists are developing fuel cells. They're kind of like batteries that can just be refueled continuously.
Oh, wow.
Potentially a much cleaner and more efficient way to power our homes and our vehicles.
So we could have a future where, like, all our energy needs are met by these ion-powered devices.
Yeah, potentially.
That's a pretty amazing thought.
It is. And it all comes back to those tiny charged particles that we've been talking about today.
Right.
They are truly essential parts of our world.
Yeah.
From keeping us alive to the technologies that are shaping our future.
I feel like this whole deep dive has been an incredible journey. Yeah. We went from the basics of what ions are to all their roles and everything, from nerve impulses to muscle contractions to batteries and fuel cells. I have a whole new appreciation for these tiny but mighty particles.
It's been fun exploring with you.
It has. Thanks for guiding us through this electrifying adventure.
Of course. Now go out there and spread the ionic knowledge.
I will. Thanks again.